Welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about a part of Irish mythology which I find deeply fascinating but also utterly confusing, since I read and heard a lot of different versions of this story but barely found two versions telling exactly the same story. So let me try to summarize it as best as I can. Let's talk about the invasions of Ireland. The invasions of Ireland can be found in the mythological cycle, in which you can also find stories about the gods and goddesses of Ireland. The thing with those stories is that they were passed on orally and never written down until centuries later. Therefore, a lot of details were lost, and others changed a lot. It's not even clear if there are 5 or 6 waves of invasions, and the versions of the stories I found with 6 waves definitely have seen a lot of Christian influences. As in a way has the rest of the story, now that I think about it. Well, for example, characters like the biblical Noah weren't really likely to have been in the original legends. All in all, the invasions of Ireland seem to be a mix of actual historical events, Christian influences, real Celtic mythology, and classical myths from other mythologies. However, I'll tell you of the 6 waves of invasions. You can decide for yourself what you think about the not really obligatory first wave, but just to give you the whole picture, I'll include it into this video. The first wave might be the wave that confused me the most. I found a lot of different versions of the story, but the most logical and least confusing tells the story about the granddaughter of the biblical Noah. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's been a while since I last read the Bible, but I can't recall any, let alone adult grandchildren of Noah, at least not prior to the flood. But maybe I shouldn't try to find logic in the combination of 2 myths. Well, back to the story. The granddaughter named Kesair wasn't able to secure herself a spot on Noah's Ark, and so she started to build 3 ships of her own and sailed away with some of her people. The journey was dangerous, and in the end only 1 ship made it to the secure shore of Ireland. 1 ship containing 3 men and around 50 women. For a while everything was okay, and the 3 men satisfied all women on the island. But at some point 2 of the men died of illness, leaving only Fintan mac Bocra to care for 50 women. Fintan was quickly overwhelmed with this task and fled into the sea. And no, he didn't take a boat. And no, he didn't try to drown himself. Instead, he magically transformed himself into a salmon. Yeah, let that sink in for a second. Well, maybe his last name Mac Bocra could have been a hint to that, since it roughly translates to son of the ocean. Well, in the end, thanks to him being a fish, he was the only one surviving the incoming flood that killed Kesair and all the other women. It is said that Fintan lived on for centuries, transforming himself into every species that ever lived in Ireland, and living life after life. Another version tells the story of Kesair's father Beith, the son of Noah. But the story is basically the same. The people come to Ireland, the flood comes and kills everybody but Fintan, who, and I can't stress that enough, just turned into a fish. However, so the first wave basically resulted in an immortal fish, but the island of Ireland was still uninhabited. The second wave was the wave of the Partholonians, who were called after their leader, Partholon, who is also said to be a descendant of Noah. They arrived in Ireland around 300 years after the deluge. It is said that they consisted of around 1,000 people, including Partholon's wife, sons, and their wives. When they arrived in Ireland, it is said that Ireland only had 9 rivers and 3 lakes. But during their stay there, some magical incidents happened, and 7 more lakes erupted from the ground. Partholon's people built homes, started farming, and all in all tried to settle and to build a life in their new home. But they didn't stay alone for long. Soon they found themselves fighting against the Fomorians, hideous, demon-like creatures who were either native to Ireland, living underground for a while, or also invaded Ireland shortly after the Partholonians. A war between both people arose, which was won by the Partholonians. So, after all, everything seems to work out for them. The society grew, and everything seemed to be peaceful and to prosper. But mysteriously, at some point, a plague came to the Partholonians, and all of them died within only 1 week, leaving the island uninhabited once more, after only a few decades. Well, actually, not completely. I don't quite know how to say that, but there was a nephew of Partholon, Tuatha MacCarroll, who, and I'm not kidding, turned into a salmon and survived. And you might have guessed it, he lived a long life turning into various creatures just as Fintan did. But that wasn't even the weirdest part. Centuries later, he was eaten by an Irish queen and afterwards birthed by her with all his knowledge. And so he taught the queen and the Irish people about Irish history. Well, I wonder if after the current plague anyone else turns into a fish. Anyway, that was the second wave. The third wave was the Nemedian wave, named after their leader Nemeth, who is also said to be a descendant of Noah, and therefore he is somehow related to Partholon. Around 30 years after the death of the Partholonians, Nemeth led his people from Scythia to Ireland. They started with around 30 or 40 ships, but they spent so much time on sea, around 18 months, that a lot of them met an early demise. But ultimately, a force of thousands made their way to Ireland and tried to settle down. Only they were not alone. The Fomorians, who previously fought the Partholonians, still tried to conquer Ireland for themselves, and again a war between both races arose. But as the Partholonians did, the Nemedians fought bravely and won battle after battle. They claimed 4 great victories over the demon-like creatures, until one day Nemeth died of another plague, which also killed a lot of his people. But thankfully this time there were also a lot of survivors. But without Nemeth and a lot of their people, the Nemedians lost a lot of fighting power. Ultimately, the Fomorians won the fight and enslaved the Nemedians. The Fomorians forced the Nemedians to pay tribute, containing of 2/3 of the children and loads of milk and wheat, each single year. The circumstances were unbearable for the Nemedians. A few leaders of the Nemedians rose up, organizing their people and fighting again. In a single attack, they managed to kill the Fomorian king Conan. But another Fomorian king, Mork, led his forces against them, and the Nemedians didn't stand a chance. When only 30 of them were left, they fled Ireland. Some of them fled into the north, others into the west, and others into the south to Greece. But wait, I must have missed something. Nobody turned into a fish. Well, anyway, bear the survivors of the Nemedians in mind, for they will play a part in the next 2 waves. Around 2 centuries went by, until the next people tried to settle down in Ireland. Those were the Fíor Bolg. They were said to have been slaves who fled from Greece. And yes, those were exactly the descendants of the Nemedians, who fled to Greece. At this point, I'm not quite sure why of all places they fled back to the place, where they must have known that monsters live who killed their ancestors. But nonetheless, they fled to Ireland. Interestingly, this time there don't seem to be any recordings of fights with the Fomorians. Instead, the Fíor Bolg founded a new society and prospered. They are also said to have divided the island into the 5 provinces as they were for a long time in history. And every province was ruled by a chief, while the whole land was ruled by the High King. They had 9 High Kings in total. You want to know how this wave ended? Well, no plagues this time, no people turning into fish, and even the Fomorians didn't manage to make the Firbolg go away again. But still, there was no happy ending. But to explain that, we have to look into the next wave, the Tuatha De Danann. The fifth wave of invaders were the Tuatha De Danann, the gods and goddesses of Irish mythology, even though in these stories they don't seem to be so different from normal humans, apart from a few magical elements. The Tuatha De Danann were the descendants of the Numidians who fled to the north, where they learned the ways of magic and druidry, and became the people of the goddess Danu, and gained 4 magical treasures. But that's a topic for another video. The Tuatha De Danann arrived not by sea, but with ships riding dark clouds which darkened the day for 3 days. Only when the mist disappeared, the Firbolg, who still lived on the island, began to notice them. Since the Firbolg didn't want to give half of the land to the Tuatha De Danann, a battle between both people arose, the so-called First Battle of Moytura. The Tuatha De Danann defeated the Firbolg and banished them to Connacht, one of the provinces. However, their king was injured during the fight and was unfit to rule anymore. But the guy they made king after him was a half-blood, half Tuatha De Danann, half Fomorian, and under his rule, they basically were enslaved by the Fomorians. To make a long story short, the Tuatha De Danann got rid of the half-Fomorian king and went into battle with the Fomorians, into the Second Battle of Moytura, which they ultimately won under great sacrifices. If you want to know more about this, take a look at my video about the Tuatha De Danann. However, finally peace was restored over the island of Ireland. Or was it? The sixth and final wave of invasions consisted of the Milesians, basically the Celtic tribes and the ancestors of today's Irish people who came from Central Europe. According to one legend, the Tuatha De Danann tricked the Milesians into their ships to banish them from Ireland. But the Milesians prayed to the goddess Era, who helped them to come back to the land, and from that point on, they saw Ireland as their land, and forced the Tuatha De Danann into the hills and the other world. Another legend says that there was a truce between both races, and the Milesians became the rightful settlers of the physical world, while the Tuatha De Danann went to the other world to rule there. In the end, after 6 waves of invasions, a lot of plagues, some people turning into fish mysteriously, and a lot of battles, the Milesians became the rightful settlers to Ireland. And the demigod race of the Tuatha De Danann? Well, they became their gods, and at the same time they became the Sidhe, the fairy folk of the other world, where they are said to live until this day. All in all, the invasions of Ireland are a mix of historical events, like for example the Tuatha De Danann coming from the north could be the Vikings, and the Fomorians may be pirates? Okay, semi-historical events. But a mix of semi-historical events, Christian influences, real Celtic mythology and myths from other mythologies. But as confusing as those stories are, they are very fascinating, and I think they are worth to be told. What do you think about those stories? And has someone you know turned into a fish during this plague? Well, leave a comment down below. If you want to know more about Celtic legends and the gods and goddesses of Celtic mythology, take a look at my other videos. And subscribe to be notified when new videos are uploaded. Thank you for listening. See you next time. Bye!